the laptop. So, so thanks all for joining. I'll start off a little bit about myself and voltage control, and a little bit about the meetup. So, because I see a lot of new faces rather, which is not surprising. So the Design Sprint Essentials is something we do once a quarter, and it's meant to just give people an introduction to the process, where typically our monthly meetup is much more about stories, people sharing their experiences with design sprints, or sometimes related topics. We've even had a complexity theory expert come talk about how complexity theory explains why things like design sprints work. And then companies like Apple and Google sharing their experiences. And so do consider continuing to come to the meetup. Not every month is about learning the process, because that would get stale and old. But we'd like to do that for folks who haven't seen it before. How many people in the room have read the book? Hands high. Okay, so maybe a third or quarter, something like that. How many have been a part of a design sprint? 2. Okay, awesome. So you'll get and how many, one person emailed me saying that they had actually attended training before, I think maybe even several trainings. Who was that? Maybe they're design sprinted out. Yeah, that was actually surprising. They were like, yeah, I attended the AJ and Smart training, I did this and that, and I want to come check out what you have to offer. I'm like, okay, cool. It may be more of the same, but all right, well, so I'm going to go a lot into kind of what it is. So the people that have read the book, it's going to sound a lot familiar, but we're also going to go into some tricks and hacks and things that we have developed that we found to be really useful. And then also some things that, just good to know as far as, it's hard to translate reading these stories in the book to like, hey, this is how we actually had to facilitate it. And then actually going through some of the activities hands-on, you'll start to have more concrete questions. It becomes less abstract, and you're like, oh, wow, what does this mean? And so want you to feel comfortable to raise your hand, stop me at any time, and we can kind of dig into those things that are not quite as clear, or that you're like, wait a second, how does this work? Or especially if you have trouble thinking about how this would translate into your company. Like if you can't imagine someone on your team doing this thing, then let's talk about it, and we can kind of unpack that a little bit. So with that, I'm going to get started. Oh, I said I was going to tell you a little bit about myself. So, man, this clicker is going to be really annoying. Maybe I should stand next to the little dongle. So I am a career-long CTO who has now formed a workshop agency, which might sound a little strange, but as a CTO early in my career, I became very aware of the fact that technology for technology's sake serves nobody. And we always have to find this kind of unison of some business need, some customer problem, and an amazing technological breakthrough. And that's where real innovation happens. A lot of people will talk about innovation as being some new technology, and it's like, that's useless. Unless we have a market case for it and we can provide value to someone, then that technology is worthless. And so I would argue it's not an innovation until we found that intersection. And so so through my career, I focused a lot on ways to create sustainable product development and processes that will get us to true and real innovation, starting with extreme programming, and then agile and lean, and all these things came out. And so when Jake first started blogging about the design sprint and some of these things he was doing on this team with Google Hangouts, it immediately caught my eye, and I thought, wow, this is really awesome stuff. And so I started sharing it with my team, and we were starting to do some design sprints, and even borrowing some of the ideas and everyday meetings and things we were doing. And then Google Ventures invested in our company, so Jake got to come run a design sprint with us. So he kind of converted from a pen pal over the internet into an in-person friend. And it's funny, my product manager was more excited about the fact that Jake was coming or the potential of Jake to come. We hadn't even booked a design sprint yet, but when Google Ventures invested, John was immediately like, Jake's coming. And he was more excited. That's all he could talk about. And here we had raised significant funds for the company, that's all he could talk about. So kind of funny. But the thing that really struck me in working with Jake and the rest of the design team at Google Ventures was that the things they were really focused on. There's so much detail and nuance that wasn't in the book that they had just picked up as consultants for running these things over and over and over again. That it really stuck with me, right? This 7 people limit, right? You read it in the book, but it's really easy to say, oh, that doesn't really matter so much. Like, it's super important that I have all these 14 people in the room, so that a lot of that's what I'm going to be sharing today. Things I learned from them, and then as I went on and left Twyla to go work on voltage control. All the things I've learned from companies like Fidelity and Adobe and Dropbox, and even the United States Special Operations Command. So we've done things from government agencies all the way to Silicon Valley startups to financial institutions. So we've seen a lot of these different things play out, and so I'm going to share these with you tonight. So let me kick it off. Design sprint's all about building and testing a prototype in 5 days. There are versions of the design sprint you'll see out there that are different than what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I just want to explain those really quickly so that if you're Googling things or watching videos and whatnot, so that you understand and can just navigate the differences. So Jake was at Google. It's where he invented the design sprint. He was kind of stuck on this project. There was a multinational project to get Hangouts started. It wasn't even called Hangouts. It was a Google 20% project they were working on. There were various Googlers from different countries. And they were having trouble just getting momentum. And they had a planned meeting, and he thought, well, what if I design the perfect week? What if I kind of pull together some activities and some things to really focus our work? What might happen? And so he tried it out, and it was really successful. But he thought he could improve it, and so he started to use this for projects within Google and trying to perfect it, and then got a job at Google doing this for projects. Like if you were starting a project in Google, you could have Jake come help you kick your project off. Well, Google Ventures caught wind of it, so they stole him away from Google to do this for portfolio companies in Google Ventures. Well, you can imagine when Jake left, that left a void at Google. So all these Googlers were like, well, we need to keep doing this. And so they adapted the process to work. They continued to evolve the process to work best for Google. Meanwhile, Jake's evolving the process to work best for Google Ventures. So what we find in Jake's book is what he found, and he and the rest of the design team found to be very effective for software startups. Specifically, the Google Ventures portfolio companies, Google Ventures is typically coming in like B, C, D rounds, so they're later stage startups like Slack, like what was that, 5 years ago, and Google, of course, is iterating on it for a large giant corporation, and so you'll notice that some of the language is similar and some of the concepts are similar. Google sprints could be anywhere from 1 day to 5 days. They generally will follow this converge-diverge dynamic. That's a big concept for them. I think we teach that in our facilitation courses, and you'll see that permeate a lot of different facilitation methodologies. It's just a great agenda design when you think about opening and closing the day with divergent for an opener and then convergent for a closer. So that's the rhetoric that Google will use. And then as you're going through these kind of steps, if you will, there's different activities that might work in each step. Whereas Jake's approach is very prescribed, it's very structured, and the structure gives you the support that you need to get the results in 5 days super quick. So I would say Google's framework is really nice for super experienced facilitators that are going deep into a problem and trying to reverse engineer what's trying to be accomplished. Design sprints are a really nice portable thing that can be used in many different situations to drive toward the very specific prototype tested output. And so, so anyway, if you see the different stuff out there between Google and Google Ventures, or the Jake's book and some of the other design sprint books, that will help clarify it a bit. And the thing we're going through tonight is about the design sprint book written by Jake Knapp, and we're going to follow that pretty closely. There's also, you'll see AJ and Smart has written a lot about the Design Sprint 2.0, which is like their version of a design sprint, which has been whittled down to 4 days. I will caution you, do not shorten the design sprint unless you've gotten experience doing it. They have done a ton of them. Also, as consultants, it's nice to not have to be away from home for all 5 days of the week, and you can travel one of those days. So that's convenient to try and shorten it down. Also, as consultants, you're going to be doing discovery with your client and trying to understand these things. And so if you shorten it down to 4 days, thinking that like, oh yeah, it's just a compressed design sprint, I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because A, you need to have a lot of experience facilitating these things to do it that quickly, because we're removing all the fluff and all the opportunity to the squishy time that can ebb and flow. And you're also assuming that there's a lot of understanding going into it. And so I would argue it's still the same amount of work. It's just how much, you're just doing a lot more pre-work if you're going to do a 4-day. So that's hopefully will help you understand the landscape a little more around the different types of design sprints. So why do we want to do this, right? Why do we want to build and test a prototype in just 5 days? And so I mentioned earlier having gone through the various evolutions of software development concepts, and one of them is lean, and it's a really solid concept, right? Like you're going to come up with an idea, you're going to build it, you're going to launch it, you're going to learn from it, you're going to kind of constrain what you're working on kind of in an agile, iterative fashion, and you get that stuff out there, you learn from it, and then you kind of move and pivot and react from there, right? There's one critical flaw to this, and that is that it takes way longer to build stuff than you anticipate. In fact, one of my favorite laws is Hostetler's Law, and it says that everything takes longer than you expect, even when you account for Hostetler's Law. So my favorite laws are always self-referential, and that one is no exception. So it just always takes longer, you know, when you're thinking about security and all these things that have to be thought through and dealt with before you put it out in the wild. It's just untenable to move as quickly as you want to get that critical feedback. And in an environment like this, it's all about shortening that feedback loop. So how can we get that path to learning much faster? And so the sprint is designed to do that. And so we're going to short circuit. We're going to go straight from idea to try and learn from it. And, you know, this concept in and of itself is prototyping, rapid prototyping. So we're going to create a simulation of what we want to build. And some people, when they hear prototype, they think, oh, well, this is some software, and it's one kind of component of it. Maybe it's not like, maybe the data is not all there, or like there's pieces missing, or it's really rough. The prototypes that we're talking about here, and prototypes can take on all forms, right? You're just ultimately trying to think about what you're trying to validate, what your hypothesis is, and then what do we need as an interface to have enough of a conversation to validate or unvalidate our hypothesis. And so, so I would argue most of the time, 99% of the time, you do not need code. And in fact, a lot of times people use paper prototypes. In a design sprint, we tend to go fairly high fidelity, but that's just so that we reduce ambiguity. We want to make sure when the user's seeing the stuff that they are reacting and understanding and getting what we're trying to share. So we always start the design sprint with a few quick ground rules, and these are super important. So, man, this clicker is going to drive me nuts. So the facilitator's in charge of the schedule, and that's super important to remind folks that you're going to be tracking the activities and letting them know when to move on, explaining things, and you'll have to lean in on times, and it might get uncomfortable. Some folks like to ask permission and just get nods from the team. They're like, look, I'm going to have to be the bad guy at some point, and it's nothing personal, and let's get that out of the way in the beginning. All right, I'm just going to stand here and do that. So the decider will make all the tough decisions. So there's a role in the design sprint called the decider. And the decider is the person that will be your tiebreaker in those critical moments. Like if there's a conversation that's kind of getting out of control and you need to kind of rein it back in, you can defer to them to say, well, Susan, what do you think? Should we do A or B? And then they make the call and you move on. And so it's a great way to keep just constrain those conversations spiraling out of control and get them back on track. And honestly, that's one of the most powerful things about having a facilitator come in, is that they can help move things forward in a way that teams just don't experience otherwise, right? Typically in meetings, they left to their own devices, the teams will just spiral and spiral and spiral and ultimately get to some decision, but they might not have covered as much ground and as the decision as durable as it could be. Also, it's a no device policy. And this is super important. And you can remind people to that they can bring if they get a call or a text or something, step outside of the room. Really bring their full attention and respect what's happening in the room. Because you don't want people heads down, and it's so easy to get sucked into like all the alerts and all the attention grabbers that happen on the devices. Even if something important comes in, once that's dealt with, like is your full attention back on the room. So just pushing that out to another room can be really powerful. Highly encourage it. And as a facilitator, you should remind people if they're on devices to either step out or put it down. Time timer, awesome device. Highly recommend it. In fact, I don't think we didn't pack one tonight, unfortunately. But very awesome visual timer. People love it. And it just helps give people a visual on how much time they have left on the current activity. They have a mobile app if you want to go a little more affordable route, but it's harder for other folks in the room to be able to see it. All right, really quick preview. So it's a 5-day process. On Monday, we map. On Tuesday, we sketch. Wednesday, we decide. Thursday, we prototype. And Friday, we test. Tonight, we're going to go through activities on mapping, sketching, and then we're going to do somewhat of a simulated decide. It's really hard to do that with a very big, large group unless we do kind of sub tables and things. And typically, if we're getting into that level of detail, it's like a day-long workshop. So we're trying to cram this all in 2 hours. So we're going to go really fast. But you'll get a sample of the stuff. Prototyping and testing. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end if we have time. But that's a little harder to workshop and just something more that you just have to go do. So mapping. All right, so we start with the long-term goal. So the point is to focus everyone on the purpose and where we intend to be at the end of this. One hack that we like to do on the long-term goal is associate a metric to it. So how are we going to measure that we got to success? And then we follow those up with some sprint questions. So these are meant to be pessimistic. What's going to get in our way? What are the critical things we need to think of? What could go wrong? Where are we going to fail? This is really helpful because as we vote on these and kind of bubble up the critical ones that we're going to take through the rest of the week with us, those can be guiding principles, if you will, like or a little bird on our shoulder that's like reminding us that that this is something we need to keep in mind and that could go wrong. Also, as a facilitator, it's a handy trick because this is the only time we get pessimistic. So if someone's being a total Eeyore, you can point it back and say, we already did that, we need to move on, this is an optimistic exercise. Mapping is essentially, if you're familiar with mind mapping or journey mapping or empathy mapping, it's a similar concept where we're going to visualize our thinking and just like get to a shared understanding. It's meant to be fairly high level, so we're only looking for about 5 to 15 steps. We start off with our actors to the left, and then we build out our map from there based on the milestones they go through. So we're not looking for every individual little step they hit, but what are the major milestones? So you can imagine this is a map of a clinical trial, and they have a lot of different moving parts, but there's only like 5 things on here. So it's really just to help us align on what is the overarching process or flow that happens, and maybe at the end of Monday, we're going to use that to target in on where we're going to focus. So also, I love this statement, and this comes from Jake, and we have a similar saying at Voltage Control, which is like, nobody's as smart as everybody. And so the notion is we're going to come together as a group and try to understand this problem better and pull it apart. So this activity of Ask the Experts This is a great hack too. If you are having trouble getting down to just that number 7, that's 7 participants, then you can bring some of the folks, rather than just removing them entirely, you can bring them in as experts. You can also do a readout at the end of each day. That's another hack to include people beyond the core 7. So if you have 14 people on your list, maybe 7 of those just come to the readouts, and maybe 2 of those people are part of your experts. The experts are just there to, because they have some perspective, they have some knowledge. Sometimes it might be someone who can't attend all week because of some other obligations, but we really want to get their thoughts. I've even had clients bring in experts from outside the company that had just had some perspective that they wanted to include. We'll take notes during that interview using a format called How Might We's. And How Might We is just a way of reframing problems in an optimistic way. And so sometimes they present an opportunity, and opportunities are really easy to write down optimistically, but the problems and issues and pains can also be reframed if you just think about it through that how might we lens. One thing that's important about how might we is the level of granularity. Like, we don't want to go too high level, we don't want to get too low level. And so we're going to practice how might we's tonight, and so I'll revisit that when we get to that activity. And again, we're going to end Monday picking a target. So you'll notice the how might we's on there. I don't know if that's clear with this so small, whatnot, but those little post-its that are kind of stuck on the map that weren't there before, those are the how might we's from the team that have gotten voted and surfaced up as the most important ones. And so we'll place those on the map relative to the place on the map that they align with, or that they impact or relate to. And that'll help give us a little bit of heat, a little bit of indication around where the potential is for us to have the most impact or actually accomplish those how might we's. Now, the decider makes the call on this target. We invite them to open discuss with the group. We invite them to consider the how might we's, but if they see another point in the map that's more critical to address, then they don't have to rely on those how might we heat. And one thing I usually coach them on is to go back, look at the goal, look at the questions, think about where they want to be at the end of the week and what's most important to learn and where they can get closer to their goal and what will set them up for the most success, and to really think about that as they're picking their target. We'll also target on a specific user, and that's important because when I talk about testing in a minute, you'll learn that we're only testing with 5 users, and so we want it to be super representative. So we don't want to have, in this case, a patient, a doctor, and a coordinator, or a patient, a doctor, and 3 coordinators, right? Because then we only have 3 that's representative of the coordinator sample, and then 1 of the other 2, and we don't really have 5 of any, right? And so it's important to hone in on that design target and really focus on them for the purpose of the week. Doesn't mean you won't come back to the others later, or that you don't include things that they would need, but really they're going to be our main focus. So Tuesday we sketch. They all start getting inspired by sharing out lightning demos. These are analogous inspirations. These are sites, websites, magazine articles, anything that you think might be representative of what we might want to go build or be inspired by. These could be competitors or people that have solved similar problems. Group brainstorms don't work, so the sketching is done completely alone, and this is where that divergent activity comes in, where we're all starting to contribute our own ideas that are wholly our own, and they're not being Mr. Potato Headed, and we can really flesh out our ideas, and we have time to do it. The sketching is done in a 4-step process to unlock creativity, and we'll be doing some of these activities tonight. And ultimately, this is so that we don't maybe jump to the first immediate solution, and that we have a little bit more of a methodical process. It also helps people that are just staring at a blank page and going, I don't know how to draw, right? Let's step through a process that will just kind of make them feel more comfortable and able to make a sketch, get their ideas out there. So the sketches typically look like this. Okay, just kidding. They look more like this, and you'll notice they're consistent, right? And there's some real power in this, and we often think about consistency and artifact when we're designing workshops, because it helps with kind of the sifting and sorting of information, because you don't have to translate between Bob's format and Susan's format to extract the idea. So there's a consistent format of the artifact. Then we've already processed that arrangement. We know what that means, and we can just go from sketch to sketch and pull the learnings from it without having to constantly switch and go, okay, how did they structure this? What does this mean? What is this convention? So it's super powerful, and you'll notice that how might we's also help with that, right? Instead of just saying take notes on this interview, we give you a very structured and consistent way to take the notes so that when we're synthesizing later, it's consistent, we can easily extract without that cognitive switching. All right, so then everyone's sketches are due for Wednesday morning, and we do a process called the sticky decision. And so this is all based on this notion that fast decisions with no groupthink are much better than sales pitches and in these circular conversations. Let's just make a decision so that we can test it and learn from it, rather than just having a guess-a-thon. I love that term guess-a-thon, and it comes from my friend Tom Chow from Google, who's a prototyper, and he has this other quote that I love, which is smart people come up with smart reasons for their guesses. And so be very careful of this, right? Because conjecture is usually the number one way that like startups and other companies do business, right? And so instead we're talking about, let's make a smart, quick decision. Let's not overthink it. Let's not over-argue it. Don't justify why it's this or that. Just make a quick decision, go prototype it and test it. If you take nothing away from tonight, take that away. You don't even have to run a design sprint to make a prototype and test it. And in fact, I have a colleague who believes so strongly in this, he forbids meetings at his company. His company has 0 meetings. They have things called reviews. And in fact, he wrote a Chrome plugin that updates Google Calendar and replaces the word meeting with review. So when you can't create a meeting anymore, you had to create a review. And in order to have a review, you had to have a prototype. So they will not gather anyone on their team without having a prototype. And so, like, even if you're preparing for a presentation and you're gonna make the rough draft of that presentation, there's your prototype, right? IDEO has one of my favorite IDEO quotes is, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. So prototype, prototype, prototype. It's super, super important, and that's hopefully the main takeaway. So we'll put these sketches on the wall in a gallery format, just kind of like space them out so that there's plenty of room to stand around each one and you don't crowd each other up too much. And then we do this thing called the gallery walk to create a heat map. And what we're doing in that process is, it's a forcing function to make sure everyone reads all the prototypes or all the sketches. And we have a hack that we like to do. We call it the carousel. In the book, they just say, all right, here's a lot of time to look at the sketches. Well, we have everyone stand in front of one sketch for 3 minutes, and then the timer goes off, and then you rotate like a carousel to the next sketch. And because I found that, sometimes the longer sketches will get more attention, and it does a disservice for the people that spent all the time to like really dial it into the pure essence, right? It's like if I'd have had more time, I'd have written a shorter letter. So sometimes the shorter sketches have more thought put into them than these long rolling ones that just have like where someone just like verbal diarrhea all over it, right? And so so that time constraints nice. Also, I think people are more likely to talk if they're roaming around the room and all huddling around the same sketch, or they might point at something and chuckle. So like I found the carousel to be a really nice hack, and encourage you to try it out. And meanwhile, they're standing in front of the sketch. They're looking at things and thinking, what are the most critical elements in the sketch? Where's the real meat to this thing? And what stuff could I really be excited about having in our prototype to test on Friday? And they put a little dot on it. And they have unlimited dots. They can dot as much stuff as they want. And what we're doing is just generating this heat map on the whole sketch as to what stuff's important to talk about, or what are those kind of key things. And so the speed critique being the next step is when we gather everyone and we start to talk about those dots and where the things have emerged as the big concepts. And we'll put Post-its above the sketch kind of with just titles, the headline of the big idea. So it might be progressive disclosure, or it might be ease of use, or whatever this concept is. We write it up, slap it at the top. So that's a little reminder, is like what the big idea, what's going on with the sketch, like why is it there, like, and then one thing to keep in mind is that the author of the sketch is not allowed to sales pitch their idea. They, in fact, are encouraged to be silent during this process. And usually, before I move on to the next sketch, I'll say, who sketches this? They'll raise their hand. I'll say, did we miss anything? I didn't invite them to tell me what it's about. I just like, is there a big idea we didn't get? So as a facilitator, I really try to hone in on, or constrain them from kind of trying to pitch it and talk about how awesome it is. A, it eats up a lot of time. B, it influences and biases people. And honestly, no one wants to hear it. So the decider ultimately makes the call, but before we do that, we do a quick straw poll, so everyone gets one vote. You'll get a lot of groans when you hand out that one vote, because no one wants to make the decision. But again, teaching people just to make a decision. Like, and the thing is like, you remember, unless any of you played college or professional sports, you probably have not, or maybe are in your community theater or something, you probably have not been to a rehearsal since elementary school or high school. Why is that? You know, like, and I find it really awesome that the design sprint, or prototyping in general, is a rehearsal for the corporate world. Like, we should be doing things where we can go out and like be safe to fail. And you know, we talk a lot about in lean startup and agile and things. It's all, and innovation is about like being willing to like embrace failure and stuff. And that makes some people feel uncomfortable. And the thing is the thing to understand is like, if you limit your blast radius, like, it doesn't matter if failure happens, right? And that's what rehearsal is all about, right? Rehearsal, you're like competing with your teammates, and it's not really part of the championship like scoring, right? And so, super important to think about. So anyway, we want to train these people to make quick decisions, and they can learn from these behaviors and apply that to everyday work. And so we'll get those groans, they'll place their votes, and then the decider makes a call. They get 3 votes. These are the binding votes. And these 3 sketches will be either kind of distilled down into one prototype, or they might be multiple prototypes. And if it's multiple prototypes, we'll pit them against each other when we test. And so it's really important, if you do multiple prototypes, to make up a fake brand. Sometimes we even make up a fake brand if we're doing a single prototype, because we don't want people to associate this new thing with the brand they already love, right? Like, let's really learn the merits of this offering without the halo of this other brand, if you will. Sometimes we'll do it if we want to compare it with what we're doing today versus where we think we might go. And so we can get people's reactions to like, but if they saw the same name on it, it would be, the suspension of disbelief's a little harder, right? They get into this like, oh, this is the same thing, and they're kind of trying to figure out which one's better, and I'm going to hurt their feelings if I don't like sing the praises or whatever. So, and then in the Rumble, same thing. You definitely don't want them to see 3 versions of the same thing. So just come up with different names, and it's pretty fun to invent a brand in an hour. And we'll usually do a note and vote, which we'll see the note and vote activity later tonight. And that's one of the most versatile tools in the design sprint, and you can use it in everyday meetings. And I'll talk more about that when we do the note and vote. But we'll just plant that in the back of your head, that when we're doing the fake brands, we'll use the note and vote to come up with a brand name. So we'll turn the winning sketches into a storyboard. The purpose of the storyboard is to lock in all our decisions, because if you think about it, the sketch is a bit of a skeleton. There's going to be a lot of meat missing, especially if the sketch was made by someone who doesn't have experience in user experience design, or any sort of software experience, or just the building of software, if you will. And so there might be like modal missing, or like, wait, how do you get from this to this? Like, the concept's great, but like, what's the flow? And so we figure all that stuff out in the storyboard. We also start to like really nail in headlines and titles and copy and messaging. And if we can't decide it inside the storyboarding activity on Wednesday afternoon, we make a list of jobs, and we say, okay, this thing needs to be addressed, and Susan's going to do it. This thing needs to be done, and Diane's going to do it. This other thing Bob's going to take care of it. And so what we're doing is we are locking in as many decisions as possible, so that on Thursday, new ideas can't be introduced. And then if there's some remaining things to figure out, there's one sole person responsible. So then we don't get into this group conversation stuff that's going to slow us down, because there's a lot to do on Thursday to make a prototype. And we want the prototype to be as robust as needed to test our hypothesis. And sometimes that can be quite involved. And so we want to make sure we just hit the ground running on prototyping day. So Storyboard allows us to do that, along with assigning these jobs. So that's a hack that you won't see in the book that I think is really powerful. Just kind of assigning these jobs. Another one is the note and map, which we'll get into. Note and map and the note and storyboard are pretty much essentially the same. So prototyping, realistic facade is all you need to learn from customers. So we're really just trying to create the illusion that exists and make it as high fidelity as we can in one day. It doesn't necessarily, it's not going to be back to real data. It's not going to have their name because you're testing with 5 different prototypers. But we're given an illusion that this thing is there and functioning, almost as if you went through it and took screenshots using it, right? It's all hands on deck. We've got these jobs assigned. Everyone's lending a hand, getting it all done. Prototypes can simulate mobile apps. There are tools that allow us to make it look like there's a native app running. We can do a rumble where we have 2 different kind of brands implementing 2 different concepts to solve for the same problem. We can also print materials and make like on-the-fly packaging to like demonstrate a new brand concept. We can 3D print, materials and apparatus. We've also rented furniture and reimagined a space and wrote a script and had members of the team acting out different roles to see if we could reimagine what a new environment might be like for this particular example was for a healthcare center. How can we create a new experience for folks as they're kind of coming in for urgent care? So Friday is the test. 5 customers is enough to reveal the big patterns. This is based on research done by the Nielsen-Norman group. You can see it goes asymptotic at about 9 users, but again, you're like up and like way above 80%. Whereas the 80%, you're about 5 users, and it's really nicely fit in one day to talk to 5 people. It's not too exhausting, and then also we're typically doing this iteratively, right? So we'll learn a lot from those 5 users, then we'll rinse and repeat. It's important to make sure that you're looking for insights that are consistent across all 5, because one tendency I see is that people will hear someone say something that validates something they feel strongly, but only comes from one user. And then in the retrospective, this attendee is like really talking about, well, what I heard that was really consistent. I'm like, pretty sure only one person said that. So you might want to go back and review the notes. That's another thing that also I really recommend doing the retrospective on the following week, because if you're doing it at the end of the day, Friday, you're going to be suffering from the recency bias. So the person you just interviewed is going to be more top of mind. Also, it's just exhausting, so you're kind of brain dead, so not a great time to do your synthesis. Regroup later and just look over things. It also gives everyone a time to just process on their own and then come together. We also have a hack. We developed a scorecard that I'll show you as well. So the whole point is we want to fast forward into the future. We want to amplify our learnings, get to them much quicker than we would normally, and this is all about one-on-one interviews. It's not a focus group. It's one-on-one. It's also not a usability test. We're not going to give them directions or tasks that we watch them follow and see how hard it is. Instead, we're just going to ask them to talk out loud. We're going to get really curious about how they feel about a page, like what they're noticing. And we ask them things like, what would you do next? And if they say they would click on a button, I might say, what would you expect to happen when you click on that? And then, we're like, if they're talking about something completely different than that's about to happen, that's really helpful to know. We're also really listening for the language they use. Does it match with the language that we're using? Are we consistently hearing that they talk about this stuff in a different way? Can we start when we adopt their language rather than trying to train them to use ours? So that's what this is all about, just getting the reactions to this stuff and how they feel about it, what it means to them, how they interpret it. The team's going to watch from the other room. Super important, because if you just get someone else's synthesized report, you're probably not going to watch the videos. You're probably not going to internalize it as much. But watching it in real time means that you're going to deeply empathize and suffer with these people and understand kind of where they are and how they think about this stuff. And you're going to be able to interpret their language versus how someone else has synthesized it. And so it's super powerful. Also, it's like, especially for teams that haven't done this stuff before, for them to sit through it and watch it, experience it, and for the light bulb to go off means that you're going to build more allies and more support for this type of user-centered design and kind of curiosity-based software development. And that's super important as well, just building that culture. So get people in the room. So I even encourage people to invite folks that if we have a big enough observation room, why not bring tons of folks in so we can really grow the culture. So the whole point's identify patterns, and this is a screenshot from our scorecard, which if there's time, we'll talk a little bit more about tonight. But the point is, like, we're looking to see how we can answer or rate our various sprint questions as well as questions we have about our prototype. So we'll rewrite the sprint questions as yes/no questions, so they become a bit of a binary gauge during the interview. As a moderator, I'll never ask these questions to the tester, but I will ask questions and nudge them and prompt them in ways to try and get them to answer those questions. And so the observers are just listening for opportunities to say, oh yes, I believe I can confidently say that this is true based on what I'm hearing them say. And this is just a graph that we generate after they've all filled out the scorecard, and it's basically just kind of given a heat map on, like, was it generally more positive, more negative, et cetera. So at the end, you'll typically know what to do. Often it's helpful to fix it, test it again. We don't typically need to do a full design sprint. In fact, like, it might just be tweaked. We immediately know what we need to do based on the interview. We just tweak the prototype, test it. Sometimes it's a little more of a not quite there. So, like, we might go back and look at another one of the concepts, or we might need to get together and align on the direction before we tweak the prototype and test it. So anyway, that was a mouthful, and it took way longer than I intended. So tonight, I'm going to kick it off with the activities section. We're going to go through this fake application. So we're imagining we're working for a company that is a dog walking service. And the goal of our design sprint is to create a pet walking service with 100 pet owners and 25 walkers walking dogs daily within 6 months. So this is a pretty good goal, I would say, because it's like kind of looking out into the future. It's very measurable, and we can understand if we obtained it or not. And it's also very focused on the problem space, right? So one thing I'll say is when you're running a design sprint, it's helpful to at least have some idea of the goal or the direction of the design sprint going into it. But I would not have the goal fully crafted, because it's something very powerful about having the team work through this together and getting aligned on it. They're going to own it, and they're going to feel like they were part of the process of making it, versus if you just put the goal up there and say, let's talk about it, right? And so typically, I want to have some rough idea of where they're targeting, because they may not be in the spot that makes sense for a design sprint. So I don't want to walk into something that's going to be a big failure, or it's just a waste of everyone's time. And so we'll come in kind of roughly armed with the direction and what they want to accomplish. And then we just start to kind of facilitate conversation. And I'll typically be taking notes on the whiteboard, little sentence fragments, little things that they say. They're like, oh, that's interesting, that's meaty, that might be something to consider. And then you take all these notes and start to distill them down into, like, well, what if how can I just pull all this into one coherent sentence, right? So you just start finessing it on the fly, and then asking them, did I get that right? And then sometimes if they're having a healthy debate and conversation, you could be over there kind of playing with it and trying to get it right. And then when it kind of settles down, you can say, hey, check this out. What do you think of this? And I think it's super important as a facilitator to always be validating and not telling, right? So we're just getting like, did I get this right? Let me make sure that I heard what you were saying instead of saying like, oh, this is my synthesis of what you did and this is your goal, right? So we would definitely want to get confirmation that it's theirs and that their goal is solid. That's an activity that's really hard to do with a large group like this. So I just made your goal for you. And all these activities will be fairly cooking show style. So like we get a little bit of practice with it, and then boom, here's what we're going to use. So we're jumping straight into this goal. We're pet walking on service, and we're going to be having some dogs walked. So this is an activity that I'm going to have you all do, the sprint questions. So I went over this in the long preamble, and so I'll give you a little bit of a reminder. So this is somewhat pessimistic, right? We're going to think about what are the challenges, what are the things that can potentially trip us up. What do we need to keep in mind? What do you think will prevent us from being able to actually create a dog walking service, right? So the way this works is this is a note and vote. The note and vote, surprisingly, has a note step and then a vote step. So the note step is you individually just noting down the things, whatever it may be. In this case, the sprint questions. You don't have to, there's no prescribed tool or supply for this activity. And as a facilitator, always make sure to tell them like 3 or 4 times what supplies to use, because remember that consistency and format matters so much. So if someone uses the wrong pen or puts something on the wrong thing, theirs is different and now it jumps out, right? And it's just cognitive overload. So for this, supplies don't matter. You can write on anything you want. You're just going to make a list of all the things that you think could get in our way if we were going to try to do this. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to write down your own thoughts. Also, the folks that are sitting back at the tables or the chairs on the perimeter, if you would come in and find a table, there are plenty of chairs, or if you want to stick with the soft chair, just pick it up and bring it. And you'll find the supplies at those tables. Who needs 30 more seconds? So, little facilitator trick. You had the 30 seconds, but that was my way of letting you know that you only have 30 seconds left. Okay, so I'd like you to look at your list that you've generated, and I want you to pick your top 3. So in no particular order, you just want to think about which of the 3, and if you've only got 3, then there you go. Or if you only got 2, then that's cool. So go ahead and pick those. Going to prioritize the ones that you think are going to be the most vital, the most critical. Also, think about things that could be tested on Friday. So if you wrote down that our CEO is allergic to dogs, well, there's not much we can do about that in our testing on Friday. So we probably want to just table that for other, maybe we need to just send him to the doctor to find some allergy shots or something. But or maybe political things that are happening inside the company. Those are challenges, and those are vital things to write down when you're considering the stuff. But they're not necessarily going to be the most useful for taking with us as our primary questions for the sprint. So that can be a good litmus as you're thinking about the 3 you select, the ones that are like we could actually validate with a prototype on Friday. Sometimes that's hard to know if you haven't done many sprints before. But so what I would do next in a real sprint is now, because it would only be 7 of you, I would go around in a clockwise or counterclockwise. I usually like to start with, pick a different person to start with, mix it up. I just pick someone, we'd start with them, we'd go around the room. They would share out their first one. We go around Carousel, and they're just sharing them out. I'm writing them up on the whiteboard as we go. And then when we get to the 3rd or 4th person, usually their top thing, the thing they're about to share, is already up there. So what we're doing is deduping on the fly, right? And so then they move down to the next one. So we just go around like that. And then after I've gone around the room once, then I say, does anyone want to, out of the 3 you selected, are there any that you think really need to be added? Or have we covered most things? And then we won't do a full round, but a few people will raise their hands, and we'll capture those as well. And then that's our note kind of part. And then we go on to voting, which is like everyone will write down 3 that they want to keep with us for the rest of the sprint. And I'll generally number them. So I have them all written up on the whiteboard, and I'll number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then just ask everyone to write down the numbers for the questions that are, the most pertinent, the ones we want to keep with us. And then I just go around on this circle again, just ticking off the ones, just using little hash marks next to the ones that people vote on. And then and eventually we'll get to, where everyone's voted, and there'll be 3 to 5 that have surfaced as the top ones. And those are the ones we take with us. So that's a note and vote. You can do this note and vote. You can kind of forklift this right out of the design sprint and use it for any everyday meeting. And if you think about it, like the power of this is because when people come into the meeting, they've generally come directly out of some other meeting or straight out of traffic or something that's got their mind occupied by some other topic. You may have sent your agenda, which if you haven't, you should have. Everyone should be making agendas, and not enough people do it. You may have sent some read-ahead material. They may or may not have read it. But I will say that if you give them time to reflect at the beginning of the meeting on how they feel about it or what they think we should do, what's their decision, what's their argument for moving forward, you give them time to articulate that, there'll be more voices in the room. Because it won't be the people that happen to have had time to read it right before the meeting, or the quick thinkers, or the people that just like to talk a lot. The people that require a little more processing and maybe need a little bit of a context shift, have that quiet alone time to think through their idea, their point of view, and then we all have an opportunity to share. Everyone has their time to go around and share out how they think we should proceed, and then everyone makes a call on, or kind of points out how they think that which one has the most potential. Now, a decider or the project lead or whoever put the meeting together may come to a completely different conclusion, and that's fine, but at least we had an opportunity for everyone to really share their voice. Great way to run meetings. And so, anyway, that's the note and vote. What we're going to do now is I'm going to do something slightly different that's more amenable to a larger crowd. I'm just going to have popcorn, have some folks share out some of the questions that came up for them, and we'll kind of talk about which ones might be good ones or which ones might be hard to test, etc. So who has one that they think's really good that they want to share out?
Get the first customer.
How are we going to get the first customer? Okay.
How does geography play into servicing users and walkers?
Yep, exactly. Awesome.
How to pick up or return a pet?
Yeah, so what's the protocol for the walker getting the pet and returning the pet?
Liability for aggressive dogs, injuries to walkers.
Yes. What are the legal ramifications and liability?
Why are we doing this? I mean, we know there's a market. What's the purpose behind this?
So I would argue that's I love that question because it helps me bring a point home. That one's not a great question for two reasons. It's a great question because it's curious and hitting on a very important subject. But from within a design sprint, it's not great because it's very broad. Yeah, the questions don't have to be quantitative. It's good to have a metric on the goal, but it's very wide and broad. And also, if you're doing a design sprint on something that you don't know there's a market for, you're already going down into bad territory. You should do research ahead of time to make sure that you understand the market, the viability of where you're going, how users think about the stuff, how they relate to it, and then so your problem validation should already be done. This is about solution validation, and in fact, solution development and validation, right? Because ideally, we're not going in with predefined solution. Although there's been stories of that. The example in the book was Slack, where the head of product and the CEO had two competing ideas, and then they put those head to head in the book. But anyway, great point, because I think that's an important thing to know and consider.
So does that, would you say that then you would have already done your research into the owner group and the walker group, so you'd already know that their personas?
Yeah. Yeah, and because of that research, you're going to have some meaty questions, right? In fact, the legal question might be very specific, right? How are we going to deal with this specific regulation that we learned about in our research?
How will communication work between walker and owner?
Yes, I love that one. Yeah, it's super important.
What pre-existing technologies exist to bring the walkers and the customers together?
Awesome. That's almost a how might we statement. I love that it's a lot of people are just naturally optimistic, right? And so definitely think about how can we think about what are the things that are not necessarily opportunities, but what's going to get in our way. So an example of something that might get in our way that's external. You're talking about using external tools is well, how are we gonna compete with Rover? I forget whatever the other ones are, right? That could be, or how do we differentiate ourselves from Rover? I mean, that's that kind of a pessimistic / oh gosh, this is something we're gonna have to deal with, right? Not some opportunity we might be able to harness, but it's great thinking. It's just the nuance on the crafting those questions. Anyway, yep.
How would we know that the dog likes the dog walker?
Ooh, yes. How to collect those ratings? That's funny. I haven't heard that one before. Did the dog actually enjoy it? I've heard one that's similar a lot, which is how can we be confident that the dog wasn't harmed, or that they were they got the care and the attention that they deserved. But this one about did they enjoy it? How do we get the doggy seal of approval or something? Yeah.
We're bringing dogs into the office now on Friday.
Yeah.
Or whenever we're
Do they want to be there?
That's what we're testing. I like it. Do that.
That's so good.
Triggers it.
Yeah, maybe we can do some brainwave analysis or something, right? Any others?
How do you deal with bad weather?
Bad weather? Yeah. Another popular one is security. How are we going to handle getting in and out of the home? That's one, right? And then my favorite was I did this in this workshop in Paris, and this one French gentleman had a very thick accent, and I wasn't quite sure what he said. And also because so he said, "How do we handle when they need to do their business?" And I was like, so he's like, he wasn't super direct, and he had a thick accent, and I was like, what are you talking about? And then finally I figured it out, and I was like, I said to him, oh, how do we deal with the poop? And they all thought that was hilarious because I said poop. But anyway, so that's a problem, you know. It's like, what's our protocol on that, right? How are we gonna deal with that? Now the other thing too is this is a tough one because when you're crafting these questions, you don't necessarily know your target yet. And if you did, you'd better vote more intelligently on these questions, right? Because if we selected how do we deal with our poop, and then we end up targeting the landing page, we're probably not going to talk about that on the landing page, right? So that's not a very valuable question. So maybe that's another thing to think about, like when you're doing these questions, is how robust they are. Like, will they apply no matter what we prototype or what area or what part of the process or problem we look at? Or if you think that there's a part of the problem that's really important, that's the thing that we want to focus on, then you could start to seed some of that with your selection of your questions or the questions you propose, right? Like focus those on the things that are like the most important ripe areas. Any questions or do you have any questions about the concept or what we're doing, or do you want anyone want to share out their questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
How many questions do you end up with?
So 3 to 5 typically. Yeah, and so for instance, it really depends on the distribution of the votes. So if 3 of them get all the votes, then clearly, if they're kind of evenly spread out across 5, I just take all those 5. If they're spread out more than that, then I'll do a revote. Or sometimes I'll have like 3 of them that have a concentration, and then all the other votes are spread out as ones across the board. So then I'll do like another round of voting, just constraining to the ones that have the 1s or 2s or something like that. There's no real hard, fast rule, but I think you want at least 3 and no more than 5. Any other?
For some reason I got out of this that the sprint questions are questions about how we're going to fail. So how does that relate to?
Yeah, so I think it's tricky, right? Because if that prompt can be misleading or confuse people, because if they're like, well, how are we going to fail? It's like, well, I can list out all the way, like, you know, the office could catch on fire and like all, you know. So if you think about it more, like what will make us fail, like what will get in our way, like what challenges or what kind of obstacles will we have to go around and things that like are germane to the problem, right? And so zombie attack would surely be bad, but like, is that really related to what we're working on? Arguably, right? Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's more about like what are the challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
You stated the goal, then that to me means you've already defined the problem that you're solving and formulated the goal as a solution. So what's the problem here?
In this case,
Well, in this case, I get it,
Yeah.
because dogs, but
yeah, you know, no, that's where the research and the upfront work comes in, right? Ideally, they've done some problem validation, and they understand where they want to be. They don't necessarily have, and they realize that the problem is that, or they want to solve for this ability to have a dog walker, but there's lots of nuance within that solution and I would say the nuance is where what I would refer to as a solutioning versus like, and I see what you're saying. This is not framed as a problem statement, and that's important. So this goal, you could argue that this goal is framed as here's the broad solution we're going for. Let's get it down into like the specifics of what it is. Yeah, and you're right. Like typically when I get the sense that they're not ready for a design sprint, either it's 2 reasons. Either they need to do more research because they just don't understand the problem space, or they haven't gone through good problem framing. So that's when we'll go through some problem framing activities.
So what about the basic business model? Like, for example, are these walkers independent contractors or are they employees? That's a really fundamental question.
Sure.
And do we make that decision a priority, or do we make that in the design sprint? Because,
Yep.
one or the other brings about a whole different set of problems.
There's no steadfast rule there. I think it's going to depend on the team, the stage of the company, and what they're seeking to accomplish right now. I can't say it's always out or is always in, because it's just too. I think it's too dynamic to make that steadfast of a rule. In the case that you just brought up around are they employees or not, that could be. I think that could be a valuable question. I wouldn't so broadly frame it as the business model. I mean, it impacts the business model, but I would want to be more specific around what is the employment status of our walkers. All right, that's a big challenge question that we got to figure out, and maybe we think that's an important question to answer. So in our prototype, we're at that maybe we're worried about, like, say another question is, will we be able to recruit enough walkers? And then employment status is another question. Those kind of work in tandem, right? And so that you could see those both getting voted on, and then the prototype ends up kind of steering toward like the marketing material, the landing page for the walker to try and get them to sign on. And then you maybe learn their preference or how they feel about this employment status, right?
Yeah, but like in this business, I think stability for the walker would be very important. It's not like an Uber where, anybody who gets you from point A to point B is good enough.
Sure.
Right. Here, there's
Yep.
relationships with the dogs and the owners.
Exactly.
Those people want stability.
Sure.
So,
Consistency.
yeah, consistency.
Right.
I have, so this kind of goes to his question and somebody else's question. So I'm thinking about it as like, well, now you got 25 dogs per walker, supposedly. So are they walking them all at the same time? Are they walking them one or two per hour, every 30 minutes, every 20 seconds? Like, how is it structured as far as that goes? And I keep getting hung up on that. Like, that's a big challenge if you're designing an app. Are they signing up for a 30-minute slot? Are they want 16? They want their dog in a group set. Does that mean now we have to interview each dog and see if they get along, so to speak?
Sure.
Like,
So there's a lot there, right?
Yeah,
And so I think the thing is like to unpack that into its constituent concerns and questions, right? And so, I mean that could easily have been like 4 questions, I think, right? And so just list them all out, right? And then just go, which ones like, gosh, that's super important for us to remember and figure out. And also keep in mind that, like, I can tell by the way you're framing some of that stuff, like you clearly worked on this kind of stuff before, right? And so we're not so concerned at this point around like feasibility of the solution because we haven't gotten to the solution yet. So and that's actually part of the genius of this activity and getting that pessimistic thinking out of the way, because then it's like, okay, like don't do that anymore. Because we want to start to get really creative and get into an ideation mindset, because through like wading through something that would be very problematic could get us to a point where like we discover something new that like, whoa, that's really cool. But I would never gotten there if I hadn't have gone through something that wouldn't have been possible to build. And so definitely being able to turn that off a little bit, or at least subdue it, because I know it. Like being a CTO for many years, I had to be the no guy. I had to be the guy that's shutting down the crazy CEO that came back from heli skiing and like telling me some harebrained idea he had, and I'm like, you can't do that, And so, you just gotta kind of balance that a bit. And so the questions can help with that, but more succinctly, I'd just say just like go with it. Just whatever, everything you're thinking, oh man, how are we going to do that? How would you do this? And then look at it and go, what are the more poignant ones? And then that list is still going to be with you. When it's time to think about sketching, when it's time to think about implementation, like I encourage people not to throw the stuff away. Like hang on to it and let it stick with you. Okay, I need to move on unless there's any real burning questions. Okay, yeah.
I should have asked this like 20 minutes ago, but when the kind of walkthrough that you gave us for the entire week, do you do that same walkthrough like on site whenever you
Yes.
actually
I do it twice. And in fact, I went way longer than I normally do because I was just riffing on hacks and little tips and things because I know you're wanting to like learn the stuff and potentially go do it. And so I would not have gone, like, I tried to do it in 10 minutes versus the 30 minutes or something I spent on it tonight, which is more than I wanted to. But I do it twice. I do a kickoff call the week before, and then I do it on Monday. Just, it's important to set the expectations and then also remind them, like, hey, this is this harebrained thing you're doing this week. Sometimes, you'll have a CFO in the room, right? That's like as far away from this kind of stuff as possible. So it's really important to be there and guide them through it and make them feel comfortable. Okay, the map. So we've got, I talked a bit about how the map works. We've got a pre-built map. Let's just, live with it. But the way this is work is similar to how I was talking about the question, right? Like, it's sometimes helpful to maybe talk with the client or with their team, or even if you work at the company, you might already know some of this stuff, but ideally you work on a different team and you're not trying to do double duty facilitating and solutioning and being part of it, because it's really hard. It's just impossible to be unbiased and really know when the conversation needs to end and all these kinds of things, right? You should have no horse in the race. So we got pet owners and pet walkers. You could argue there's also operations staff. There might be people in the background wearing headsets and like doing routing and this kind of thing, but keep it simple for the sake of this activity. We've got, and that's a good point. Like sometimes when you're looking at how you break down these maps, you could come up with all sorts of different kinds of actors and roles and people, and at the end of the day, you really got to focus in on what's the most important thing. And if you look at our goal, it was really about like starting this thing up, and walkers, walking dogs, and they're clearly going to have to interact with pet owners. And so since this thing isn't running, it's not about optimizing existing operations staff. We can probably assume that stuff, we'll have to figure that stuff out. Of course, we might even do some hand waving like kind of things, but it's not going to be the critical learning that we need right now. In fact, if none of it's built, we're probably testing a landing page. That's like 99.9% of the time is like we're testing something very, very upfront in the map. And so that can also keep you honest with keeping the map simple too, because why do all this work detailing all this stuff that's like way too deep to test? And that's also for like analysts and developers and people that just get really nerded out on systems, and they're the ones that are going to want to go deep into the map and like we got to test this algorithm. It's like, yeah, that's going to be fun and cool, and it's going to be awesome when the time's right. But like, let's not even go there unless we know that like our assumptions that we gained from the problem framing and from the research hold true with the solution, and when they actually react to this thing. And so so typically it's like the upfront stuff, right? How they discover it, how they first start to engage with it. So here we have this pet walkers app, and so again, it's like 5 to 15 steps. The pet owners are going to join. They're going to set some kind of preferences. They're going to request their first walk, and the walk's going to happen. But in order for that to happen, the pet walkers have to apply. They have to get onboarded somehow, and then they get this job to walk the dog. And then there's some kind of review process, and people get paid, that kind of stuff. But we're not getting into all the little details. And so, did I see a hand go up? No. Okay. So the next thing after getting our map kind of in order, and let me explain the note and map. So the note and map is kind of like applying the note and vote concept to the map, because the map is always messy. The thing is like Jake has this saying that if you're doing it right. And sometimes you have these really hideous maps that don't make any sense, but the team's really proud of it, or the team like feels so much more aligned than they ever had, and they're like, I didn't even realize this thing was happening over here, or like, oh my God, like I've had CEOs go, I didn't even know this was happening in my company. And so the process is really illuminating, because what you're doing is you're visualizing thinking, you're having a visual conversation, and we're getting past misunderstandings and over talking and just getting to this kind of shared visual that helps us all understand each other. And so the fact is that the messiness can make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And especially as a facilitator, when you're starting with a blank screen and an empty whiteboard and you're like, what do I even start to put up here? So the note map can be really handy because what you can do is you can actually ask the team to start to draw out a map and put their steps on Post-it notes. And then you just go around the table and have them put their Post-it notes on the whiteboard, and then you can start moving those around to construct a map. So basically, you're kind of crowdsourcing that stuff. You're giving them time to think through the parts of the map that they know about, that they think are important, and it also moves in parallel too, right? Rather than having this kind of single conversation, it's kind of like 7 conversations going on. It's just they're having a conversation with themselves. So that's a little hack for the map that can be really powerful. Another thing is like sometimes we'll do a little bit of mapping up front, especially if we're doing problem framing with them. Like typically we're doing mapping, so we'll just kind of borrow those maps that we already did if they brought us in to do that work, and then we'll kind of use those as a rough starting point. It's like, okay, from what we know, these are the actors and these are some milestones, and then you leave some stuff out so you can slowly fill it in and like tease it out of the group and get them to kind of own it and talk more about it. All right, so after we have the map done, the next thing we do is ask our experts. And so I'm going to simulate this. You guys are going to take how might we notes, and I'm going to interview someone. And typically, as a facilitator, I will start off the interviews so that I can kind of lead by example, and everyone else can start following my style rather than me trying to explain how to or teach them how to ask the right questions. And so, that's a good technique. So we can do that tonight too. As I'm interviewing, if you have a question that you think similar to what I'm asking and you want to just scream it out, it's just like, that's how it works. It's just popcorn. We'll just get curious about this person and their experience and how it might relate to what we're building. And while we're doing that, we're going to take notes in a how might we style. So what you do is you grab a Post-it or a stack of Post-its. You might have to split some of these up if there's not enough stacks on your table. And you grab a fat expo marker. The reason that you make them use the fat expo marker is because we want to constrain content. What we don't want is a Post-it that looks like this, because who can read it? Now this is for note and vote, so it's fine for that. But for how might we, or just any kind of Post-it we're going to hang on the wall, this is not great. And that's another thing to go with to help your attendees with their Post-its. Actually teach them how to write Post-its. That's actually a quick little micro lecture on that. It can be really helpful to make the workshop go better. So a Post-it note that if we're going to do any affinity mapping and we're going to share the stuff out, if that's the intent of what you're using the Post-it for, and it's not just a little memo to yourself, you want to make sure it's clearly legible. If you have bad handwriting, use all caps. That's a great way to turn bad handwriting into great handwriting. Just slowly write in all caps. Write big, write slow, and a Post-it should only have one idea. It should not be a run-on sentence. It shouldn't be a bulleted list. It should be one succinct idea. Think newspaper headline. And so the how might we is no different. You notice this one up here. It's like, how might we help dog walkers get into houses? A very simple, succinct statement. If you have a very long one, think about how to split it into 2. Or think about like, well, is there too much fluff here? Like, how can I get to the critical, like, what is the real juice here? Because that one could have read, how might we help users unlock doors and blah, 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 and it's like, well, really, they're just trying to get into the house, right? Okay, so how might we is you'll start by writing HMW in the left corner for upper left for how might we, and then you'll just kind of have your pen ready. And remember, I see some small pens, big expos. Remember to always remind your folks to use the right materials, because if you've got some how might we's on the wall that are like tiny little thin line marker and some that are big, it's going to be harder to process them because they're different. And then also, people have a tendency to write a lot more on the Post-it if they got tiny marker. So what you're going to do, write HMW and just have your marker ready and listen for that problem or that opportunity, and then jot it down and then peel it off, slap it on the stack, HMW, wait and listen, and then eventually you'll have a whole pile. And then once we're there, I'll walk you through what we do with them. So who in the room owns a dog? Who owns a dog and would like to be my candidate for interviewing? Bam, here, could you come up for a bit? And what is your name, dog owner?
Dara.
Dara. Nice to meet you, Dara.
Nice to
Thanks
meet
for
you.
volunteering. So Dara, what kind of dog do you own?
I have a female beagle.
Female beagle. And how long have you been a dog owner?
Oh, about over 10 years.
Okay. And what do you do when you need to leave town or can't care for your beagle?
Well, right now I would be looking for somebody to come in and help her. She's a geriatric beagle,
Mm.
and I'm new in town. I've been in Austin for 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I would look online for somebody who had experience with geriatric dogs, who knows that beagles are scent hounds, that they smell, so walking isn't going to be, a quick walk, but she also has medication, so they need to know how to give meds to a dog.
What other types of concerns are there with geriatric dogs other than the medication?
She also has IVDD, which means she has 2 vertebrae in her neck, so you have to be careful of her neck.
And when you say be careful, what do you have to watch out for and what might happen?
You don't want them to pull,
Mhm.
so she wears a harness.
Okay.
And also with geriatric dogs, sometimes they have hip dysplasia where they have a hard time walking.
And you mentioned going online to find, you're new to town, and going online to try and find someone. Where do you think you would start, or have you started to look around?
Probably either using Google and doing a Google search. I'm from Seattle, so I'm aware of WAG and Rover,
Mhm.
but I would also probably look on Craigslist for people who post there, as well as my apartment complex's intranet.
And why would you look at those other places versus just going WAG or Rover, the ones you've heard of?
I like to look at all my options, price comparison,
Mhm.
as well as quality of care.
Okay. And if you saw, what do you think are some things that you might see in ads or in your research that might prevent you from using someone or a service?
If they're not certified in pet first aid, if they've never medicated a dog before, if they haven't had any kind of training. I have a bias toward vet techs because they're kind of like the nurses of the pet world, and so they usually have that experience. They also have experience if something goes wrong, what to do.
Great. Okay, so that's just a brief sample. Usually that would go on for like 10 or sort of 20 minutes or so, depending on how many experts we have and a lot of time. Anybody have any other questions for Jara that I didn't ask?
No, I'm sorry. No, I have a question for you.
Yep. Any questions for Jara? All right, how about a round of applause? It's very brave to come up here and do that. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, question for me.
Sorry, the question for you is, what was the strategy in your head as you were kind of leading her through the story of her and her dog and her needs? Do you have a strategy to enlighten us with the answers?
My strategy is just to be as curious as possible and be as active of a listener as possible. So I usually like to start off with really soft stuff that is going to generate nothing. But like she started talking about her dog being geriatric, like right out of the gate, right? So that's clearly very important to her. And as I started to ask about her research process, she even talked about vet techs being important, and she talked about like experience administering medicine, and that's all associated with that very first thing she brought up. And that came out of one of the softball questions that seemed like innocuous, like, is that really going to reveal anything? And sure enough. And so definitely if they bring up stuff like that, then it's good to dig into it more. Main thing, I mean, this is standard stuff. Don't ask any leading questions, and certainly don't disguise your leading question as a multiple choice question, because it's still a yes/no question. It's just a yes, no, or just A, B, C instead of yes and no. Those are the main things, and I just try to as open-ended as possible.
I don't know what the aspect it talks about it there, but do you
explain your goal or what you're trying to do, or do you leave that out?
Great question. I usually do. The only times I don't do that is if they're an external expert and it would just be noise for them. And what we're bringing them in for is to really understand their experience with some topic or something versus them having to translate into like our map and our world. But definitely if they're internal stakeholders, we'll ask for their feedback on the map. And we'll kind of give them a tour of what we've been doing because their insights and understanding of this stuff could be really powerful in addition to just like their experiences, right? It's like, what's your interpretation of what we're doing? And or do you immediately see any blind spots?
So the stakeholder's not necessarily an end user or someone that's involved in the process from that perspective.
Yeah, typically we're not bringing customers in at this point.
So that's kind of a novelty with having her as an example.
Yes. I was just using that as like, rather than having to like, because it's more likely to get pet owners here than people who work at, work in a pet service, right? So.
So maybe a vet tech might have been better.
Yeah, exactly. A vet tech would have been potentially good to interview. Maybe someone from your operations staff, someone from marketing. I mean, sometimes I've even had teams interview folks that are in the sprint. So like they're a participant, and then all of a sudden their role just changes a bit. So instead of writing how might we, they're getting interviewed. There's no reason you couldn't interview customers. We've done it before. It's just not Friday's dedicated day for testing with the customer, and ideally you've done some research ahead of time, so you already understand kind of generally how the customer's thinking. And in fact, one thing we like to do is bring in the user researcher who did the research, and have us interview them and what they found during the research. Okay, cool. So what we'll do next? Okay.
So how might the exercise is in addition to sprint questions, or is it either or?
Oh no, you do both.
Either or.
Yeah, so you'll start off the day. So I'm basically going through the run of day. So we start off with the goal, we do the questions, we do the map, and then we do the expert interviews with the how might we's. We're about to wrap up Monday. So the last activity of Monday is similar to the note and vote we did for the questions, except what you do is you pick your top 3 or 5 how might we's. And so you would go through them, pick your top ones, and then we'll put them on the wall. And then on the wall, we're kind of trying to find clusters. And the reason that we do that is twofold. It's a fun way of getting everyone to read them, because you're kind of occupying them with this activity, right? Because they're about to vote on these things, and so like you give them an opportunity to just process them all. Also, the clustering helps you dedupe, right? So if you start putting stuff in buckets, and then you put these things in the bucket, now they're side by side, and you're like, oh, that's the same thing. So that way your votes don't get distributed across the same thing and they get devalued. So we'll have so what you would do next is look at your how might we's and pick your top ones. And so maybe just to simulate that a bit, if we could just like maybe pick for tonight, maybe pick 1 or 2, and if you could share them out, we'll just talk about, because just like the questions, there's an art to writing a good how might we, because it's kind of this Goldilocks zone. You don't want to go so specific that it's like, how might we make the button red? It's like, okay, sure, we can make a red button, but it's like not great for exploration. And then also it could be like, how might we create a dog walking service? It's like, I think that's what we're kind of looking at doing. So again, what's that? How do we constrain it right in that middle lane where it's kind of juicy enough to do some stuff, but not so broad it's debilitating. So we'll read some of those out, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit more about what you do after the readout.
How might we help the owner have trust in the law?
That's a great one, and it comes up a lot, right? And we heard in her in the interview that there was kind of there's some concern about like there need to be a vet tech to have that trust or et cetera, right? So.
How do we maintain stability in walkers?
Yep. How the consistency and yep.
How do we address special need dogs?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, we heard it. That's a great one, right? We maybe weren't even thinking about like geriatric. I like that you expanded it to special needs, right? Thinking like, oh wait, it can't be just geriatric dogs. What about amputees? And what about all these other things yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I kind of had, how do we specialize in geriatric
specialize in having vet techs or just being
Sure. Yeah.
vets all of our walkers.
So these are all sounding like they're right in the right territory.
I don't know if this is the right question, but how might we get users to test this? Like in our room itself, there was only one person who was ready to come and talk about it. So I don't know if there'll be users who are ready to get their dogs to go and walk just to test that out.
Sure. So, sorry, you said that question was based off or inspired by which part?
That only one person was ready to come up and talk about their dog.
Yeah. So that's probably a bad simulation on my part because, well, not many people like to get in front of crowds, so that's like not a great representation of like would they test it or use it. And then B, typically we're writing these how might we's very centered on what the expert's saying, right? Like they're inspiring us to think about the problem based on their perspective. And also I would hope that our early research would have shown us that there's a decent market pool. And another thing, just another point there is I've generally never, some recruits are harder than others, but it's generally pretty easy to find testers.
How might we define all search options?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like you know, because she was talking about, that was one of the first things she would do was go online, and also you heard her talk about she's going to do cost comparison. So like that's clearly going to be something that people are thinking about. They're cost conscious.
How might we provide training and certification to the dog walkers?
Yes. So like that's interesting, right? Because she talked about vet tech, but how might she feel that would be a great thing to test, right? If you heard kind of fairly consistently that this kind of accreditation mattered, what if you became a certifying body, or you know, there's lots of different routes you could go, but that how might we could kind of get the gears turning along those lines. So those are great examples of how might we's. You know, again, I think they're right in that zone. Not too vague, not too broad, and we'll get them all put up on the wall. We're sorting them together. We're looking at them. We're combining them. We might put a label up just so that everyone knows. Oh, these are the ones that are about cost. These are the ones that are about confidence or certification. These others are about trust. Or here's a few about different consistency or these kinds of things. And then everyone gets 3 votes. And they go and put their votes up, and then these are kind of somewhat binding because they just kind of allow us to find the ones that people generally thought were the most kind of intriguing or the most would be the most useful to take with us as we go into sketching. So then what we do is we take those how might we's that are that we get after sorting and voting. So you'll see like some of them got votes, and then we'll take those that have votes and we'll move them onto our map. And we'll place them. We'll basically say, all right, well, someone, and again, we've got the wrong map in here. But so say that was like a search or discovery kind of step for dogs. Then I forgot whose, I think it was yours. How might we's about the search would go right by that step because that how might we's talking about that step specifically. Some of them are more loosely tied or might be just between 2 steps or around a few steps, but you kind of generally localize them where they relate to. And so it creates a little bit of heat on your map, which will help you inform your decision. And again, the decider doesn't have to use that, but like it can be a great way to just be an aha moment, right? Wow, all the stuff that we learned from these experts and captured and voted and bubbled up to the most important things, the important opportunities, are all concentrated in this one area. Maybe that we should go test that. All right, so our target tonight is going to be pet owners joining the app, because we have a hypothesis that there's plenty of people that love dogs and would love to work as dog walkers, and we can find the right people. And even if we have to first be the dog walkers ourselves, we think we can solve for that. At scale, that might be a more difficult problem, but we can. At this volume, we could probably work the phone lines and just make it happen. But the pet owners, like convincing these people, building this trust, that's the critical piece that we think that we're going to need to accomplish. And so So that's our target. Whether you agree with it or not, sorry, that's what we're going to do. And so we get into sketching. And so this is where you're going to do the most activities. You won't have to listen to me talk as much. We're going to actually go through a couple examples of lightning demos, and then we're going to do some sketching. So lightning demos, again, like Jara mentioned WAG and Rover, which like great analogous inspiration because they're doing things that we might want to be inspired by or want to avoid. In fact, lightning demos can be both positive and negative. They can be things that like we're inspired, we think like, oh yeah, let's go kind of borrow from this. They could also be things that like, ooh, we don't want to even go close to that. So that's important. TurboTax seems to come up like about like 75% of the time. I don't know why, but we call it the Kevin Bacon of lightning demos. So you'll notice this grid, right? And it's on a whiteboard. So what we'll do is we'll capture these thumbnails of the lightning demos, and it's just like a really quick, rough sketch just to kind of jog people's memories. It's not meant to capture all the details on the screen, but it's probably hard to see because they're tiny. But let's jump to this big one. So here on Rover, we've got the service list, and the big idea is it's like clear service, right? So at the bottom, we'll typically label it with like what it is, and then at the top, we'll write like what the big idea, why that we shared this, what did we think was awesome about this, or what did we think we want about this that we wanted to avoid. And so you'll have this grid of thumbnails, which you'll use during the note-taking activity. So I'll come back to that in a bit. And this is an example of a thumbnail for an RX bar, transparency, natural ingredients, class pass, powerful messaging. And that might be something that we feel like that they offer a unique way to message back and forth between the client and service provider. And this is not necessarily something you'd even want to look at if you were building a dog walking app. The point is just to drive home that these can come from random places. We're doing a dog walking app, and here someone's bringing in ClassPass, and so that's the expectation, right? Like we want to look at things that could be competitors, but it could easily be just random other things. So here we have, electric toothbrush, and then we go into the 4-step sketch process. So the first thing you do is note taking, and so in note taking, the concept is like before you ask people to start ideating and to start trying to come up with things, we want to make sure that all the kind of the guardrails are in place, as well as all the sources for inspiration are there. And so bringing them back to the goal, bringing them back to the questions, and then that provides kind of the guardrails and kind of just how we frame where we're headed, and then jotting down the how might we's that inspire them if they want. You don't necessarily have to include every how might we in your sketch. You don't have to include any, but if you see one or two that really are speaking to you, jot them down. And then also we'll jot down any of the lightning demos. So that's why we draw up that grid so that people can go around and jot them down. Another hack we'll typically do, because sharing those out can take a long time, and so we like to kind of collect them into some sort of document that the facilitator can share out. And so depending on the company and their security rules and access to tools, we might use Google Docs or Mural. Surprisingly enough, Mural works with a lot of the corporate firewalls where Google Docs doesn't. But Google Docs is so simple that we'll typically default to that if people can use it. And the whole point's like they're just dropping in URLs and notes, and then I can pull up that doc and just open it up and let them kind of lead it and describe it, but we don't have to constantly move the projector dongle around and all this kind of stuff. So that's something to think about. And so another thing is they all have access to that document after the fact. And so if they see something on the sketch that jogs their memory and they want to go back to it, it's all there. They have all the links. They can easily go back and look at it in more detail. And sometimes if you're doing a lightning demo on something that requires a login or a user account, we'll just ask people to take screenshots, like log into your account and go through whatever you want to demonstrate and just take screenshots along the way. And so that's another, having those in that document is great, because then other people that don't have an account can still go back and kind of check them out again if they're needing it for their inspiration. So, yes.
Do people prepare the stuff for the lightning demo before the sprint starts?
No, I do have one client that does that, and it's crazy. Like, she assigns all the lightning demos, so all the other attendees like get a list of like, here's what you're gonna show. I mean, that's the way she likes to do it, and we're just kind of play ball.
Source from sort of questions that arise in the process.
See, I think that, to me, that's the more interesting way that's how it's as designed. I think for that purpose, she's interested in making sure to socialize some of these things in the industry and competitors. So it's like she's taking the research she's doing and realizing that no one else is doing, and kind of using that as a way for them to like, because if they present it, they have to like look at it deeply enough to talk about it. So I think it's a little bit of like political dynamics at that company and how she's working around them. But yes, you're right. You're gonna seize more opportunity if people are inspired by things that are happening through the process. So more specifically to your point, I usually assign it at the end of the day Monday. And I'll say, guess what? You got some homework. You can figure this out in the morning if you want, but at least because I mean, the thing is like, it's pretty easy homework, right? You just gotta, in the back of your head, think about what you might want to show, and then just give me a URL in the morning. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over notes because it's like, this is a simulation, so it's not as important. But do keep, this note step is super critical, because if someone starts trying to ideate and trying to like think through their solutions, and sure, there's stuff up on the walls, but are you like straining the sea? And it's like not, as if it's not right in front and center, it might not be top of mind. Also, there's some internal like subconscious synthesis that's happening as you're just writing it down and like internalizing it, and it's kind of a ritual, right? So what we're gonna do, just in the sake of time, I've put them all. Just take a look at this and pretend like, just to reframe yourself on the goal. And, we've got a couple of how might we's copied down. We have our map. We don't have any of the how might we's here, but you wrote some, so you could just like you just pretend like those were the ones that got voted up, and kind of live with it. So this next step that is the step 2 in the sketching process is to write down ideas. And so think of this as like personal brainstorming. So you're not really solutioning yet. You're not really getting down to the like, this is how it works. It could be even just like things that don't even work together. Or like, you could write down 5 different ways you could go with your sketch that just don't even, like, they're mutually exclusive. You could start brainstorming different elements, or like, oh, if I did this, I could do that. And then this could build on top of that. And so it's really just, let it all flow. Don't judge it. This is not about quality. No one else is going to see this list. And so you just want to generate as much as you can as far as like where you could go with this. And so I'm going to give you a few minutes to make your own list. It does not matter what materials you use, although I love the Papermate Flare pens. I use them for all my writing now because they don't bleed, and they write really, really nice. So yeah, just make a personal list of ideas. Like, what do you think, if you were going to make a sketch that, again, I'll bring these up as if this was your note sheet that you had written down in front of you. And if you were going to target pet owners joining the app, what do you think you might do? Like, how are you going to entice them in? What kind of interesting, novel things might you do? What kind of standard things might you do? Like, what needs to happen in that process? Just words. Some people doodle. Like, if you're a drawer, if that's how you think, get your thoughts out, then absolutely draw. But format doesn't matter, because we're not going to share this out. This is for your own personal use. It's for you to process your thoughts and get to a point where you're ready to build your sketch. Okay. I'm stopping you at 3 minutes on an activity that usually lasts 20 to 30 minutes. So it is a short, abrupt moment, but we can't be here all night. So after ideas, we do a pretty fun activity called Crazy Eights, and it's one of my favorites. And this can be really difficult to explain. A lot of people, I find that no matter, even on the teams that get everything, have no questions, we get to Crazy Eights, and this is where they get totally stuck, which is kind of funny. Because they're looking for rules. They want to know, well, what do I write in each square? And it's like, well, there are not really any rules other than just be creative and mix things up. So the point is, like, if you think about it, it's if you're going from square to square on the sheet of paper, then if you're refocusing on a blank square every minute, then it's like looking at a blank page, right? And so it allows your brain to kind of reset and explore new possibilities. And so some things people do are, if you think about a landing page, for instance, you might rewrite the headline a few different times, or try different ones, or riff on, like, what's the headline, what's the subtitle, and so it really is, like, if you feel like at first you're like, oh, I'm gonna play with my headline, and then you write 3 headlines, and then you're like, on the third one you're like, ooh, that's really good. Then maybe the rest of the other 5 squares, you do other stuff, right? So you can just kind of play with it, and sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes people make really cool, like, discoveries, or something unlocks for them. So quick math quiz. How many times do I fold the paper to get 8 squares?
3.
Yes. Good answer. And we'll do hamburger, hot dog.
The opposite of what you just did.
Yes.
How I like it. The hot dog way is the way I like it.
But what you don't want to do is to have a bunch of long squares. So you should have a paper looking like this. Boom. Okay, so we're going to do this and get ready for square number 1. Oh, also on materials, I recommend using the small paper mate, because the big expo is going to be hard to draw any detail. You can maybe draw a smiley face, but not much else. So small paper mate flare. Ready, first square. Second square. Third square. Fourth square. Fifth square. Sixth square. Number 7. And number 8. Excellent. So the next phase in the sketching activities is called, well, solutions. So this is where we'll get into the final actual sketch. This is the format of the sketch. So you're going to have some space at the top for the title. A lot of times you don't know what you want to title it at first, so I just recommend people leave space. Title is written in the big fat marker, so you can read it from across the room, and we have something to refer to it. Remember, these are anonymous, so instead of saying this is Susan's sketch, then we have a name to refer to it. Also, the sketch itself will be written in the felt tip Papermate pens, because you want to have enough fine detail. You don't want to use squiggly marks. You want to actually take the time to write copy, craft your solution to the actual details, because that's super important. Because if you just showed the user on Friday Lorem Ipsum or squiggly marks, they're probably going to go, I don't know what this is weird. They're not going to have any real kind of concrete feedback. Or if you're not a great illustrator like me, or if you just want to provide extra detail, the gutters are a great place to write in stuff, annotations, or maybe like you could point out that like you're leaving out steps because you kind of boiled this down to the critical milestones, but there's some things they're going to do in between, or maybe how did they get here, right? Or how did they get from here to here? It's great use of this kind of side rail area. Or you can, if you draw something and you're like, I don't know that people will know that's a dog, just like label it dog. Pretty quickly they'll know, okay, that's a dog. You can do horizontal panels for like desktop screens, or if you're just trying to model like a business flow, I think horizontal is like a little easier to deal with. But for mobile apps, the vertical orientation works quite nice.
Do you take all these ideas and then we boil them down into one of those?
Well, it's not necessarily, you're pointing to your crazy eights.
Yeah.
So sometimes people use their crazy eights in such a way that everything on their crazy eights ends up in their sketch. Sometimes people use the crazy eights in such a way that one of their squares ends up being the foundation of their solution sketch.
But that you source out of the crazy.
Yeah, you'll source from your crazy eights, from your idea sheet, and you could even go back to your note sheet and go, oh, wait, okay, this is where the sketch is headed, but let me go back to the questions and see what I'm missing, what I might need to incorporate. And a lot of times people will do a rough draft and redraw it 3 or 4 times. And so the sketches typically look, it's kind of hard to see, but hopefully you can make that a little bit. You see it's got like a little hamburger thing up in the left-hand corner. So this is like a mobile landing page, and you can kind of, there's a logo up there. There's someone walking a dog, and there's this browse button, and then some kind of cost, and then large header image note, right? That's important detail that they wanted to communicate. Don't gloss over the fact that this is meant to be big and in your face, maybe to draw empathy or whatnot. And then new walker availability, that's like a little call out. On this other one, and this one's called transparent price. So it's kind of testing that. What if you put the price right up front? Does that make people trust you more? Or does it make people unsettled? This other one, this notion of mega buttons. So it's like, can they get in and do these different things quickly, right? Previous jobs allows users to see past charges and or money made. And then map your walk. So this one's based on this hypothesis that hey, what if you can kind of craft your dog's experience? So it kind of gets into that question someone had of how did the dog actually feel about this? Did they actually enjoy it? So if you know that your dog likes to go certain places because he can bark at a squirrel or something, then maybe you want a bit of map it, and that'd be a unique way to differentiate yourself. So that's taking a very unique stance, right? Where some of the others are more familiar. And so you'll often see that and when you're kind of deciding on Wednesday. And this is the point that's the saddest for me, having to cram it into 3 hours, because I really love to see where people take the sketches. but it's just impossible to do that. And I did it once, and we were here till like 9:30, and I was like, okay, never again, because everyone was just dead after. So what I'm now going to do is just jump into a little more kind of just kind of explaining versus showing, because it's just the time constraints. I prefer to. My favorite is just to do as much like showing as possible and hands-on. But we just have to kind of blast through it, and I want to make sure you get some of these points. So definitely stop me if you have questions, and we can make this last part interactive just from a conversational standpoint versus like activities. So imagine like the art museum, right? So I brought in some samples, and in fact, I can hand out some of these so you can pass them around, because I know it's probably hard to see as I was like walking through. I kind of had this thought I was gonna hack this a little and do it a little bit different, but I just think in the spirit of time, I'm not gonna do it. But I was going to actually paste some of these up on the wall just to kind of simulate that. But ultimately, you take your blue sticky tape and you kind of double-side it and put them up on the walls. I generally like to get them about 3 feet away from each other, so there's enough room, elbow room, when you're looking at a sketch, someone's not kind of hanging over your neck. But here's just a couple of examples you can pass around that I had up on the projector. I don't have a ton, so like maybe just take a look, or there's three different ones, so you could look and pass around. So as I'm explaining this, you can imagine these being up on the wall, and you're looking at it, and we're taking those little blue dots, and you can kind of see them kind of simulated on here. And I would be looking at the sketch, and actually, let me borrow one of those if you don't mind. And so I might be looking at this one, and I might say pet profile creation. Oh, that's really interesting. Like, I can create a profile of my pet and talk about his special like medicine needs and stuff. And that, I don't know, maybe there's something to that. Maybe people will like that. So I might put a dot there by that, right? And that'll create a little bit of heat on that sketch. And so by the end of this kind of round where everyone's kind of looking at for 3 minutes at each sketch, then everyone's kind of soaked it all in, and they put dots on them, and we go around, and the facilitator will stand in front of each sketch, and we'll just start talking about it. And I'll point at the dots, and I'll say, hey, there's some dots here beside this pet profile. What do you guys like about that? And then the team will start talking about what jumped out to them, what they liked about it. And then, so we're capturing ideas. So I'll grab a Post-it note, and I'll grab my fat marker, because we're looking for headlines here, and I'll just write pet profile, right? So then I got pet profile, and I'll stick that above the sketch. And below the sketch is where people will put things that concern them. And so that will be things like, oh man, I don't know how we're gonna, like this map thing, like, do we have like GIS resources to pull this off, or anything that concerns you about the sketch? It's a way of kind of voicing that concern, so that as people vote and we discuss and critique, we can kind of expose some of that and maybe debunk it, or at least like it can influence people's voting. So after the speed critique, we're going to have these big ideas above each sketch. We're going to have the concerns below them. And then there's another groan moment, because we give everyone one vote. So they have to pick one sketch that they're going to vote on. And so one confusion here is people sometimes often get confused with the granularity of the voting. So the how might we's, remember we grouped them just for affinity, and the whole purpose of that was for deduping and getting everyone to read them. But because they went through that activity and then you ask them to vote, they think they might be voting on the category. So it's important to remind them, no, we're voting on individual how might we's. So same thing here. Sometimes they get confused. Are we voting on the big ideas up top? Or are we voting on the panels or the dots or what? And so just make sure they understand they're voting on the whole sketch. Like, what sketch do you want to prototype? So this is a straw poll. It's not binding, but it will send a message to the decider as to what's going on in the room. And often the decider will tend to side with where the heat is, where the indication of the straw poll. But sometimes they may have broader insights and say, you know what, I think it's going to be more important to sketch this. Or maybe they'll take two, so the decider gets 3 votes. They might put 2 of theirs on sketches that were interested or indicative of out of the straw poll, and they might put another one on something they need to pull in. In this case, you'll see there's 2 votes on one and 1 vote on another. So they can distribute these votes however they want. And so in this case, this is an example of, someone's trying, the decider is sending the signal that this is the sketch that I want. This is the main flow. This is the foundation of the prototype, but we want to pull in some of the ideas from this other sketch. So that's where we get into. Go ahead. Yep. Yep.
Just to make sure I'm clear, like would that group of sketches all be like with one purpose, like pet profile, and it's like 5 different ideas for how to lay out a pet profile?
So these 5 sketches would be 5 sketches focused on, remember our target that we're all sketching for was,
Join that.
Yep.
Okay, but it's like one basic screen.
Well, no, usually we'll have 3 panels, and sometimes like the flows will jump over screens. So if we were to, sometimes the prototype, even though it has 3 panels, will have like 15 pages. Because once we start getting into the nuance of how that's going to need to be built and how we learn all the things that were indicative on this sketch, then, because for instance, right, this one has a browse walkers. It has a real-time price feedback loop. So we might have so this is 2 screens, and then we might also have the browse walkers go somewhere. And remember, the decider voted on another sketch too, so we might be pulling in ideas from that sketch that lead to other pages that this might link to. I'm seeing some skepticism there, so I'm not sure I answered the question well. But and then so the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the rumble or all-in-one. So this is a good example. So imagine the decider said, this map your walk is really interesting. And then also this like transparent price is really interesting. Well, those 2 things are in direct opposition from each other, right? Because one says like we need to put the price front and center. The other says we need to put this map front and center. Now you could say, well, we like the mapping idea, but we don't want to put it in front and center. So that's a way of making it an all-in-one. We do 1 prototype, putting those sketches together, just folding the map down into like maybe there's a call to action on the main page that has the cost to go like, hey, pick your map or whatever, pet profile or whatever these things are. So that's a way of kind of baking them together. But of course, like if we think like, no, the integrity of this sketch, we really want to test, what if we lead with that as the main value prop that differentiates us, then we would have 2 different prototypes. One that's got a map up front and one that's got the cost up front. So that's this notion of the all-in-one versus the rumble. And then from there, we start to storyboard. And this is a hack that we do that's not in the book called the user flows. It's basically using note and vote for your storyboard. So first you just have everybody write out their own story flow. So like how are we going to onboard the user, and then what steps will they go through? So it kind of creates a bit of it's the seed of the storyboard. You can think about it as almost like a script for the interview. Like if you made it linear, what kind of steps would they go through? Now, the prototype might not be linear. There might be different ways that we link the screens together. But for starting, it really helps people, especially people who have never done products before or haven't thought about like storyboards. And this is the first time they're seeing this stuff. They really struggle with it. So if you simplify it down to like it's just a story, a linear flow of how they're gonna go through the system, and what are the pages or milestones or steps that they're going through, it really helps people kind of ease into the storyboard versus just having a giant empty whiteboard and go, all right, what happens first, right? And so we'll go through a similar voting activity like the question voting, and then ultimately. We'll have like a grid on the wall. We'll put those Post-its on with the flow, and then that allows us to start fleshing out the screens. And so you'll notice that there's some arrows linking from, different spots in this, or different cells in the storyboard that link to others. And so that really helps and lock in and inform how the prototype's going to look. And so, again, lots of work to do on Thursday to build this thing. And so we don't want to introduce new ideas on Thursday. We just want to go heads down and execute. And so the storyboard allows us to lock in decisions. Because what someone saw in some rough sketch, and we turn it into a very crisp, like, this is what's going to be on the page. This is where it links to. This links to that. This is going to say, hello world. This is going to say, go away. This is going to say, buy now. Like, being very, very explicit allows people to, like, buy in on it or speak up and say, no, this is not right. And so that allows us to move very fast on Thursday. Again, we assign jobs. So as we're getting very specific, sometimes we just can't know right then. It's going to require some research or some time to figure it out. We assign it to one person, and that one person will go own it, and then the prototyper has one person to go find, and then there's no groupthink, and they can just go execute on it quickly and get it done on Thursday. So Thursday we prototype. Again, we're going to divide and conquer. Everyone has very explicit jobs. We go and we get after it. We have a suite of tools we like to use. These are typical go-tos, but we'll sometimes mix and match. And of course, a lot of times clients will have preferences. Like if a client uses XD, then we'll use XD. Or sometimes our clients are doing the prototyping and we're just facilitating. So it really depends on kind of what you're familiar with. But in case like you're not familiar with any of this stuff, Abstract is a great tool for revisioning in Sketch. So if you are a Sketch user and you're thinking about collaborating on a prototype, Abstract can be a great way to move in parallel and kind of synchronize your changes and track revisions. Craft is a plugin for Sketch that allows you to connect your Sketch projects into LinkedIn and do all your linking between the various steps of your prototype. It's a lot nicer than like exporting all these files and then uploading them to InVision. You can just have all that stuff locked in the same project. Again, like there's other tools, Flinto, XD. I mean, I feel like there's a new one every couple months. So this is just a suite we found to be pretty effective. We're really fast in it. But again, the important thing is that the client has a lasting artifact that they're going to be able to use. So I would not want to enforce InVision on someone who uses XD. We might as well just get in there and use XD. And all these tools are so easy to use. And in fact, InVision and Sketch are starting to compete with each other. So InVision's created like a UI development tool called InVision Studio, and Sketch has created some stuff that mirrors InVision's capabilities. But I don't think either one's like really as good as the other, so we found it's better to use the individual tools. But one thing I will note, some people like to use, oh gosh, what is that platform? It's like Framer.js is kind of a version of this, but the one that I see more often is, no, Figma is like an online version of Sketch, and people seem to like it. The one issue I see with folks on that is, especially folks that are more like, if you have a history of designing and having files that you can own and touch and open, then having all your stuff in the cloud is kind of a little jarring, right? Imagine like you can't like put it on a hard drive and know that it's there. It's like, what if Figma goes away? Or like, which the same argument can be made of Sketch, right? Like, what if they go away and and OS X upgrades and you can't open your Sketch files anymore or whatever, right? But I think psychologically that's uncomfortable for some people, and so I think that's the main difference between Figma and Sketch. But Figma also it's like InVision and Sketch combined, like it does it all. But this is more of like a Atomic. So this is a tool that you can actually build applications in. It's like an application building platform where you can just write JavaScript. It's very quick and easy to use. So it's tempting for folks that have development chops to actually use Atomic. I think it is like too high fidelity. Like when we talk about the prototypes in a design sprint being high fidelity, that's like getting way, because like think about like you're debugging your prototype. it's like, that's not something you should be worrying about on Thursday. Like, that's a like, oh man, I'm staying up till midnight kind of thing, right? And then you just don't want it, right? So just be careful of that. Also, it's tempting because with Framer JS and Atomic and some of these other tools, because they are more sophisticated and you can use JavaScript and these kinds of things, you can create animations and you can make it really slick. The thing is that's not what you're testing, right? Like, we're trying to understand if there's desirability for this solution. Does the solution meet the problem? And like, people can see through the animation, the lack of animation, so definitely don't get hung up on that. The animation level of fidelity I've found to be more of a distraction on prototyping day than a value on doing the prototype. So this is an example of, oh, that's interesting. That is not the right image, but we do have a prototype we built, and this is I'll have to make a note to get that fixed. So this is a screenshot of Sketch with the Craft plugin of the prototype we made, and so all our prototypes always start off with the opening scene. So how do we ease them into the prototype? Generally, there might be something we could learn from that, but it's not really the core of our learning. We've kind of tacked it onto the front, right? And so in this case, it's an article, I think in TechCrunch, that's talking about like dog walking services, and Rover and the others are in there. And then we've got Fetched, which is this new dog walking service that we've launched and we're prototyping. And you can see, like, there's about 8 or so screens here. We've got a list view of some search results. We've got some maps. We got the pricing page, and we can click around this and whatnot. So that's kind of the example. I mean, I think that's an average size prototype. Sometimes we go deeper, but I think for the most part, it's about this size, if that helps calibrate it all.
Is there what you would consider an optimal team size for going through one of these sprints?
7 is the optimal number. It's possible to go over that. I've even done a design sprint with 20 people. I would definitely not recommend it be your first design sprint. And also, you really had to think about control of content, because the more content you have, the longer it takes to get through it. And with 20 people, or more than any time you get over 7, like even doing your speed critiques and sorting your how might we's, it's just more stuff to read, more stuff to deal with. And so, for instance, I'll do things like, if you scale up to more people, you'll, instead of allowing them to have 5 how might we's to put on the wall, you only let them do 3. So you're pre-sorting already.
So how is like designing basically an MVP coming up, answering the question of how you're going to get people to sign up for the service?
So, yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of
Because that was the question, right?
I'm kind of, well, which question?
Remember in the flow chart, it was like the question was how would you get
So our target is onboarding or getting customers, getting dog owners, right? So then, so we're getting to that right now with the recruiting. So, right, we would basically build a survey, right, a questionnaire to try and target dog owners. And so generally we're going to ask where the screener is going to be designed to not really expose what we're looking for, because we don't want people to come in and just act so they can get the fee. So we'll ask questions that don't indicate what side we're interested in, right? Or we might say, what best describes you? A parent, a teacher. This list is totally incongruent, and they're like, all right, well, okay, I'll just check off the ones that apply. So that's the critical thing, is like just making sure you don't expose what you're looking for. And also, before you write the screener, it's helpful to write a list of things that you think would, bless you, a thing that would qualify participants, and a thing would disqualify. So attributes that you would say, all right, this is someone I want to talk to, and then also, no way I would want to talk to them if this was true. And so then you look at those lists and you think about the questions you might want to ask. And then even though all my questions don't reveal what I'm looking for, I even throw in a couple that are just like, like I'm not going to even look at the answer. But I generally, those are ones that I think they might expect me to ask. Like things that are like, that maybe just about themselves or maybe demographics or something. And that could also be helpful sometimes if I want to look at, it's not a qualifying or disqualifying metric, but when I'm looking at the potential candidates, I can diversify a bit. Like I might look at like, oh, already got a few people in this age range. Maybe I'll look at interview a few younger people too, or
So I don't know if this is what the question you were asking, but it stimulated another question, which is like, I guess if the onboarding was the focus area, it seemed like the kind of app is kind of broader in scope than that. We're showing features and everything.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just wondering how would that typically happen? Like, do you ever just like, I guess, how do you getting to broad?
the storyboard,
Okay.
because that's where we lock in what we're going to do.
So part of the hypothesis is that like a map would be necessary for the very specific part of onboarding.
The map would be specific for the. Sorry, I don't.
In this case, the map is a feature, not the map.
Yep.
So that's part of the hypothesis. Is that that's part of the onboarding.
That's what makes it more, makes it more conducive to.
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind is the decider sometimes goes rogue, and even though they pick that target, they're like prototyping something else, and it's like, okay, we're gonna learn some stuff. That's fine. But if the justification for, we didn't really have a decider here, but the justification, if we were going to make one for using that map feature, and given our target was like selling or enticing people to join, you can make the argument that that's very differentiating, and it's a completely different value prop. And who knows, if Jera saw that and saw that map up front and knew that like, oh, I can help my dog avoid this hill that's going to be dangerous for his or her hip, like that might be cool. Who knows, right? Like, but I think that's the thinking, right? If you were to,
Yeah, so as a result, the questions that you answered that resulted in the UI that was developed resulted as a result of answering the question of how do you onboard people. Like that's the focus of it, but those are the results.
yeah, and so it's interesting. The focus is more about like, are we able to sell and get these people in the door, right? So the onboarding flow is more like, here's the thing, like the landing page is where you're going to learn most of that. Would they buy the service? And then going a little bit deeper gives you insights into like, okay, well, once they've bought, like how are they thinking about some of these other capabilities? So that's why we'll maybe go a little bit deeper than the landing page. But honestly, if this was for real and I was working at this company, I'd probably not want to go very deep in the onboarding process. If this is very early on, I would prototype the landing page with the value props on it. I would probably also screenshot all the other landing pages for all the competitors. And maybe even if I learned that people are using Craigslist, that might somehow be incorporated, and like showing them some like individual people that are showing that. Like I'd get stuff from the wild that was real, but like screenshot it so they wouldn't realize like, wait, this is a live site versus this not, I want to like level the playing field a bit. So I'll turn the real world into a prototype, and then I'll show that side by side with just the shallow landing page and stuff, and just start to get insights on like how they compare this versus this. I was like, what are the pros and cons of these two different things? And like, do you have a preference over like which one? It's like blah, 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 just like start getting really curious about it. But, this is that prototype we built was a bit contrived because we were just kind of showing what kind of can happen versus like getting real specific about like, oh, this is let's get real serious about this dog walking thing, right? So this is a tool called Respondent.io. It's a really great tool for recruiting really quickly. Like they can do about like I've even gotten close to my full recruit in under 24 hours. Definitely in 48 hours, I'm pretty cooking. Unless it's a hard recruit, and sometimes it requires a little more effort. Highly recommend building an interview guide. We have an article that I can share out. I generally will take the list, anyone who signed up on the email list, I'll generally send out a little thank you for coming, and then a list of some follow-up assets and stuff, some videos that are helpful, because we didn't really really have time to really practice the nuances of how to run the interviews. So the videos can be really helpful to watch and just get a little more insight there. And then we built a couple of assets that Jake is even sharing around in his workshops and have become pretty widely used. The mod guide and the scorecard. And so the mod guide is essentially like a template that you can kind of fill out and put your personal stuff in, like the names of your testers and the sprint questions and things. But then also all this great stuff around how to prepare for your interview and the checklist of things you need to keep in mind, like don't forget to turn off your notifications. Remind them that you're going to be recording. Hit the record button. All these kinds of things. So this is a free asset we offer the community. It's just a Google Doc. You can clone it. Please, if you go to it, click on File, Make a Copy. So many people click on like Request Access, and I clearly can't give access to the template that everyone could someone could mess it up for everyone else, right? So File, Make a Copy. You'll have your own copy. You can do it with it what you want. I'll be sending out a link to the email list. 5-act interview. I'll also send out an article we wrote on how to run this. But the thing to keep in mind, the 5 steps are the friendly welcome. You want to build rapport. You want to get curious about them. You start to ask context questions that get them thinking, because you're transitioning them from the real world into the prototype. You don't want to just throw the prototype at them, because you won't get great results, right? Because they're just starting to get their bearings. So just start asking curious questions. There's a spot in the mod guide for this, so you can have them pre-made. Typically, I like to have them be kind of ethnographic in nature, and you can actually sometimes contribute to the existing research that's already done by just hearing what these people are thinking and their perspective. You're going to introduce the prototype. You're going to tell them things like, there's a whole script in the mod guide, so I won't go into too much detail here, but my favorite is to say, I didn't design this, so you can't hurt my feelings and you can't flatter me. So then the tasks. I mean, that section is called tasks, but we're not giving them explicit tasks. We're just kind of lightly positioning the prototype in front of them and prompting them to give you feedback. I hate to use that word feedback. I tend to say it, but honestly, you get feedback from experts. You get reactions from everyday people, and so reactions are so much more important than their feedback, because we don't want them to tell us what they want. We want them just to react to this thing that we're thinking that they might like. And then we'll do a quick debrief. So I have a series of debrief questions that I like to recommend. That's in the mod guide too, that you can either use those or write your own. And then, of course, as I said, the team observes from the other room. Any questions? It really depends on the company. So I'll run them quite often. We have other people at Voltage Control that are skilled in the interviewing. Sometimes the client has a research team and they have folks that can do this kind of stuff. The interview format's different enough to where if the researcher hasn't been part of a design sprint, the protocol is just a little different, and so I'll generally sit down with them and show them my mod guide and like show them the article we've written and kind of tell them a few things. But anyone that's skilled at doing interviews can pick it up pretty quickly, because it's just slightly different. But the actual process of asking the questions is quite similar.
Do these design sprints for all the different parts of the entire
Typically, you're not going to do it. I mean, it really depends on how big your project is. I've had clients that are doing massive projects, and they have a lot of stakeholders, and there's a lot of moving parts and politics and things, and so they're actually using the design sprint as a way to. I've actually been calling it requirements alignment. So rather than just like saying what we're going to do, we actually like we show it right through the prototyping. So the design sprint's a way to not only learn from users about this, so they're doing this kind of hub and spoke design. So we've been doing a design sprint for each spoke of this giant offering. For something of this size, and especially like the concept was it's a brand new company. I mean, I think resource-wise and just like time-wise, it'd be kind of crazy to do a design sprint for every feature. So it really just depends on the size of the company, the scope, the available resources. Because I mean, you're basically taking the team to focus on this thing for a week and nothing but this. And there's a lot of power in that focus and the time constraints. So, but you want to use it wisely, right? Because if you'll burn people out if you're doing them too often. I think for most companies, again, unless it's a massive group effort and a big thing, where you're kind of doing like a cadence that's kind of. Maybe you're trying to get to this destination and you're punctuating points in that destination, maybe once a quarter tops, right? But again, a lot of companies are pretty big, so like different teams might be doing them at different times. I know like my colleague at Home Depot, they're building out a enterprise design sprint capability, and they're doing them all the time. But they're doing them for different business units and different teams, working on different things, right? So it's not that same team. The participants are not the same.
So the idea is to get like one good innovation for that part of, like for this app in this case.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really about building momentum and alignment, right? And so all the things you learned together as a team and that experience of working together, that momentum is going to continue throughout the other work you're doing, right? And also the prototype's still going to exist. That's a lasting artifact. So you can, the other features that you build, you go add them to the prototype and go test them with more users. And also for a lot of teams, this surfaced for us when we worked with Favor. They knew they should be building prototypes. They knew they should be doing these interviews, but they just weren't practicing, right? They were just in the status quo. They were just kind of doing Favor the way they do Favor, right? In the way that it's like these are the meetings that happen on Wednesday, and this is and so just the act of pulling everyone out of their schedules and concentrating this week on this problem and following these good practices made them just have this awakening, and it changed the way they do business, the way they build product, and they're doing a lot more testing and a lot more prototyping. And in fact, the head of the design team is now focusing her role 100% on research. So she's doing nothing but interviewing people for future things, interviewing them with prototypes, and so it's changed. So I think it can be very transformative in how people think about their process and how they behave after the design sprint, as long as they embrace it and harness that momentum. Which it's a great question because it's a great plug for my book. I'm about to release a book in the next month, and there'll be a free PDF version. So if anyone who's signed up for the list will get our updates, and so you'll be able to see that. But the book's all about that. It's called Life After Design Sprints, and so it's all about harnessing that momentum and making sure that we are intentional about getting the best we can out of it. So it's not just like, oh, this one innovation that we got or focused on. How can we continue to kind of? It's really a flywheel, and then once it's spun up, we can really benefit from it. Anybody else?
You had mentioned earlier that this was designed for like companies who are in Series B through D. When the teams that you're choosing, like these 7 people and the decider, like are the teams like heavily like designer, engineering, product focused with like maybe one business person? Like how do you go about deciding that? Is that in the book too?
Yeah, it's in the book, but I can give you a quick answer. So it is, I would say, I don't know if often's the right word, but it happens more than it should, where it's a lot of designers or a lot of engineers or a lot of product people. And I would say that is one of the number one flaws. Number one flaw is doing a design sprint when you shouldn't be. But the second one I would say is like, it's the product team getting all excited about this thing and just doing it. And you lose all your ability to build advocates and alignment throughout the organization on the direction you're headed. Because the thing is like, I mean, imagine, especially in larger companies, like you make these decisions and you're all like, this is great, da 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 da, and then like a week later the torpedoes start coming in, right? And so like bringing folks in, a diverse group, I'm a big fan of complexity theory, and there's this notion of requisite diversity. So like we want to bring in that requisite diversity so that we get that alignment, and then we can hopefully not have torpedoes. And if there are any potential ones, we've got advocates that are going out to all those sections of the organization that are like explaining why these trade-offs were made and why we decided to do things.
Is there a size that's too small?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's a Sprint story. So Braden and Jay-Z and Jake all have a blog called Sprint Stories, and people can post their stories up and stuff. And there's this one guy that did a one-man sprint. I think it was more gimmicky, a funny blog post than anything. But like, I mean, for reals, I mean, I don't know, like 4, 5 could work, but like, I mean, 2, 3, that's like, I don't know. Like, the thing is like, I would argue if you're getting that small, you don't need the structure of a design sprint.
I think I meant more like your company. Like I have
Oh.
15 people in my company.
Yes.
It seems like
Yeah.
we probably need to be a little further along.
So, great question. I have a blog post about, it's called Design Sprints for Early Stage Startups. And my recommendation for early stage startups, so I've done a design sprint for a company of 15 people,
Okay.
but they've been around for 15 years.
Yeah.
And in that design sprint, the CEO was like hearing things and going, what? We do that? You know, so there's just, because they've been around enough and little silos got created and information wasn't necessarily flowing in great ways. So that's, you know, so I think it's more about the situation than the size per se.
But what would be the reasons not to?
So that's a great question, because that's a great way to frame it. So reasons not to do it is if the team's already highly aligned, they're already like using prototypes and these kinds of methods. My argument for the early stage that where it doesn't make sense, you know, we're already aligned, like you don't need that structure to like make the decisions. If you're making fast decisions and testing and trying things, just grab the principles, right? You can still do the things in the 5 days. You could still make some sketches together. You could still do some crazy 8s. You could still decide on how to build what prototype you want to build and prototype it. Remember my point, the number one takeaway, if you take away nothing else, is you prototype. And so that article is just all about like, hey, what are the things we can lift out of it? You can still use a note and vote. Great way to do team meetings. So anyway, hopefully that's some helpful thoughts.
Yeah.
I had a question here first.
Yeah.
Was he waiting? No.
So, from the software development perspective, number one, the most expensive bug is the requirements bug.
Yeah.
And the number one defect removal technique from all of the testing, inspections, verifications is prototyping. So if you need to sell this to your management or to the business people, why are we spending 7 people, 40 hours? You do the math. I mean, how much is this costing me?
Yep.
You can give them the money of how much it costs you to fix requirements bugs.
Yep.
It should be in your system, in your project management system, project manager. So this is the number one proven over 50 years of software development way to remove defects.
Yeah, I'd like to, and
Number two, if you're interested.
And one of the things that that's a great point. And so we have this kind of workshop we'll do if we have a big prospect on the line and they're not quite sure. And what we'll do is we'll have them first talk about all the problems, all the types of things that emerge, like around that cause issues. So maybe there's like, unclear requirements, or bad assumptions in the requirements, or, like developer introduced the bug, or I don't know, like all the things that cause problems. And then after they just kind of cathartically release all that, and we got it all in, then we have them map out their process. And like, what's their kind of flow from like concept to actually getting something into production. And then we have them go back to that first list they made and start mapping those things onto when they're discovered, when they're typically discovered. And you, not like 100% of the time, it's this like funnel where like everything's discovered at the end. And then all the clients know at this point that like everything's way more expensive the longer it's like takes to find it, because you build dependencies on it, and then people forget like what they did, and they have to go figure it all out, and then fixing it breaks something else, and blah blah blah. So then we say, look, this process. The whole point of this process is to flip that funnel around to discover this stuff earlier. So that's a great point. Was there one more question though?
Should that person be?
Yep.
If you were facilitating, you could actually choose that person or define that person. Who would be ideal deciding? Because that person has a lot of power.
Yep. And
seven, and that person has 3 votes.
yep.